So
Okay.
cool. Yeah, I would offer, but I don't have any space on my laptop at the moment, so I'd have to
Yeah, that's fine.
run from memory. So
Fine.
awesome. So I'll just share my screen. Can someone just say whether they can see my slides all okay?
Yeah, I can see that quite clearly. It's fine. It's
Wonderful.
moving nicely as well.
Okay. If anyone joins in late, Carvan, would you mind letting them in if that's all right?
Yeah, I'm keeping an eye on the chat as well.
Wonderful. Okay. So what we're going to be going through, so the first half of this presentation, we'll be going through basically how to conduct an audit when you're a foundation year doctor. And then the second half of the presentation will be relating to being an academic foundation year doctor, but also about the projects that I've been involved throughout this year. And I'll talk a bit more how about AFP works in Wales, but essentially what I've done, I've had it possibly a bit easier with regards to time management. That's the main benefit of being an academic foundation year doctor, I would say. So basically what I'm talking about doesn't, because I'm an academic foundation year doctor, doesn't mean that it does not apply for a foundation year doctor who's not doing an academic program. So we'll spend the first half, and I think the majority of the time, talking about quality improvement projects and audits. And then I'll go into a fair bit of detail about my time during AFP, and we'll leave a fair amount of time at the end for questions. Just a disclaimer about this presentation in general. So I am by no means an expert in quality improvement projects or audits. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about is based upon my own experience and what I found has worked with regards to project and what hasn't worked and what I would recommend doing. But I'm by no means, I don't know it all about QI projects and audits. So please make sure that you do your research if you're looking for anything in particular, but I will do my best to help you. And if you have any specific questions regarding specific projects as well, I'm happy to address those as well. So to start with a quality improvement project and the audit section. So a quality improvement project differs from an audit in that essentially when you're completing an audit, you're usually measuring something against a national standard. So, for example, when I was on intensive care, that might be starting any patient who is on, who's diagnosed, say, for example, with pneumonia, on particular antibiotics within a specific time frame. And this is specified by specific guidelines, such as NICE guidelines, for example. So you're trying to measure how compliant some point of care is with clinical guidelines, which are usually national guidelines. Whereas with a quality improvement project, you don't necessarily have to do that. You generally just have to find a problem and you need to put in some intervention to try and address that problem and then be able to measure the effectiveness of that intervention. Whereas with an audit, you're trying to do that with respect to national guidance in relevance to some particular part of clinical practice. In general, I would say that most of what the training programs are moving towards is largely QI projects, just because there's a bit more of a broad definition as to what they are. And it tends to be in practice, they may be easier to complete, particularly within, say, a 4-month or a 6-month time frame. You may have heard of a PDSA cycle. So that's Plan, Do, Study, Act. So that's the basic methodology of a QI project. So by planning, you sort of see what intervention you can put in place. You do it. So you put the intervention in place. You study it, so you see how effective it has been and whether there's been any changes as a result of that. And then the A is for act, so that's acting upon the results of that. So with a QI project, if you want it to gain significant recognition or to be worthwhile, the idea is essentially that you still go in a circular fashion, as you may have seen with audit cycles, what we call a re-audit if you're doing it relevant to an audit. You still have the same elements with a QI project. You're expected to go back after you've seen what the impact of the intervention is and to either make modifications towards that particular intervention that you've put in place, or you change the intervention to something else, or if the intervention has worked really well, you add something else to try and make things even better for whatever you're measuring. So why should you be interested in QI projects or completing audits as a foundation year doctor? So broadly speaking, you can split, I think, the main reasons to get involved in a QI project or an audit into an interest and into career progression. With regards to interest, it can help you see whether you like a particular speciality. So, for example, if you're quite interested in intensive care medicine, a lot of what they like to do in anesthetics and ICU in general is create algorithms or checklists to make sure that things are done appropriately and safely. And that tends to suit quite a lot of personality types that end up going into those specialties. So it can give you a good idea, if you get involved in a project, what you might be doing in the long term. In general, if you're interested in getting things better, which I would encourage you all to be, whatever professions or specialities you seek to do in the future, it's quite good to get involved in a QI project, because that's essentially what you're doing. You're trying to make things better. And as well as helping to make things better, you'll be developing a lot of professional skills, which will help you develop as a clinician, as well as progressing your leadership skills and your education skills as well. So that can all come from doing a QI project or an audit. With regards to career progression, so most training portfolios, it's probably all training portfolios, will require you to do a QI project. So as a foundation year 1 doctor in Wales, prior to COVID, it changed a little due to the sort of wave of COVID that we had hitting us in December. But as the basic standard, everyone has to complete a QI project as part of your F1 year. And that's mandatory. So you won't be able to progress further past F1 without good reason, unless you've completed a QI project. So it's something that you have to do. Often, as you progress through your careers, not necessarily as a foundation year 1 doctor, unless you're applying for things like the psychiatry fellowship or the academic foundation program, you will have to take part in interviews. And talking about a QI project or audit is often a great way of demonstrating all the skills that we've already discussed, including leadership skills and educational skills as well. And it can be quite good for sort of building up almost your reputation and your repertoire for completing projects relevant to both education and leadership as well. So it's very much worthwhile getting involved in QI or audit projects. So to just give you an idea of how this can impact you in the long term, so this is taken directly from the IMT training website. So IMT is internal medicine training. So if you want to basically do any hospital specialty, you have to apply for this training program initially. And you can see that quality improvement has its own section in the points allocation as part of portfolio. And to get the maximum number of points, you have to complete essentially 2 cycles of a quality improvement project. And even though presentation of that is not essential for IMT criteria, that can be helpful. And this is similar criteria that's part of the core surgical training program. So you can see that they basically ask for very similar requirements to be able to demonstrate it. And you can see that audit is sort of put in brackets, and QI is sort of the more highlighted sort of element of that they're looking for. So it's well worthwhile getting involved with these things as a foundation year doctor, or as you're a clinical medical student, if you're able to as well. So what are my top tips for getting a quality improvement project or an audit done? My biggest advice, and this doesn't just apply for QI projects, this applies for getting any project off the board in general, making the most of out of any rotation. Email your supervisors early. Make sure that you get in touch with not only the clinical supervisors that you've got for your next upcoming job, but the ones that you've got for the entirety of the F1 year. By doing that, it sort of shows that you're quite motivated. It shows if you have any particular interests, you can highlight those early, and you can start planning things reasonably quickly before the start of your rotation. If you speak to any foundation year doctor, you will find that what they often say, and I would definitely agree with this, is that the 4 months that you have in the job often fly by. You're often so busy that it goes incredibly quickly. And if you start to organize things as you just start the job, it can often be quite difficult to make any serious progress on what you want to do, unless you've got those building blocks in progress before you do start. I would strongly also encourage you to speak to other doctors, not necessarily foundation year doctors, but if you know any SHOs or registrars who are in the particular specialty at the hospital that you're going to, ask them what projects they've been able to get involved with. Have they been able to get involved with projects? Has the job been so busy that they've not been able to commit time to it? And ask them what it's like to work with the relevant clinical or educational supervisors. I would strongly encourage you to do this because they can give you, you'll find that you have a mixture of standards in relation to clinical and educational supervisors, and you can often gauge quite early on by emailing them whether it is worth investing, because it is a time commitment to get a QI project or an audit done, whether it is actually worth your time and effort. What I'd also strongly encourage you to do is to think about what you want to do the QI project or audit in. So think about what departments and specialities you want to do it in. That's why it's often easier to do it within your foundation years in the actual jobs that you're doing, as opposed to trying to do it across another speciality that you perhaps don't encounter within your F1 or F2 year. So try and make it related to your department if you can. If it doesn't happen to, if none of the jobs that you are doing happen to be related to the training program or the speciality you want to do in the future, that's absolutely fine. So for example, I have no desire to do ICU or anesthetics in the long term. However, one of the projects that I'll discuss a bit more later on has to do with mental health. And that's relevant because I want to do psychiatry in the long term. I would also strongly encourage you not to take too much on. I'll speak a bit more about this as an academic foundation year doctor and advice regarding projects in general. But there is a danger if you try to take on too much, you'll end up doing not a lot of progress across many projects as opposed to making serious headway in one project. What I strongly encourage you to do, so it's only a mandatory requirement to show that you've contributed to one project throughout the year. So try and make it so that you contribute quite significantly and you manage to complete a couple of cycles with one project. I would also encourage you not to take on a QI project alone. If you can involve others, it does definitely allow the workload to be a bit easier and allows you to progress things a lot faster. And it means that things are more likely to be handed over. I would also strongly encourage you to get in touch with whoever's following you in as a foundation year doctor in the next job. If you're able to hand over the project to someone else, that means that you're likely to do a more significant QI project, one that's going to last for a longer period of time, and it's more likely to be followed up and acted upon in the future. And this might allow you to expand to cover more than one department or more than one hospital. So try and think about how you can make your project as impactful and significant as possible. So what do you do after your audit is done or after your QI project is finished? What I would strongly encourage you to do in the first place is have a chat to your supervisor. If you've had a supervisor who's allowed you to work or has supported you in working on a QI project or an audit, the chances are they're going to want you to do something with it. So that can broadly be split into either presentations at conferences or to publications. Going through to conferences, presentations first, that's usually relatively straightforward to present at a national conference or a regional conference. The reason I say that is there tends to be quite a lot of interest in QI projects, and it's usually reasonably, well, not easy, but usually simple to submit an abstract and to get something accepted. So what I'd strongly encourage you to do is definitely to consider that. And that's something that can be done after only a few months work on a project. And what you can also do if you manage to have significant headway with a project or you contribute to quite a large QI project is that you can actually try and cover it at multiple conferences as well. So that's well worth considering. Publications, they're not impossible for QI or audit projects, but less sort of information is out there compared to original research papers. What I'd strongly encourage you to do to see if you are interested in publishing a QI project or an audit is to speak to your supervisor if they've had an experience with this. This can often be slow progress. It often takes in the region of months to years to get sort of a final version of, say, a QI project or an audit completely done, to write it up after that, and then to get it sort of edited down, ready for publication. And it's often only worth doing if you've got quite a large project involving multiple people, but it's definitely not something to rule out. And if you do have the support mechanisms to do that, it's definitely worth considering. So to just give you a couple of examples of what QI projects I've been involved in, one of my attachments. So on intensive care, 2 of the QI projects that I've been involved with, one has been a short-term project, so that's related to the clinical department's blood forms. So in intensive care, we tend to do bloods quite often on patients, pretty much daily for most bloods that we check in patients. And part of the problem that we were having, particularly with our pneumonia patients, is that some bloods, it was not being recorded that we were doing them. So we amended our daily bloods form to account for this. And I carried on this project actually from one of the previous academic Foundation 1 doctors. So it was in its 2nd cycle. And from just sort of evaluating how well the intervention had worked, and just doing a little bit of data collection from that, so seeing how often the particular investigations had been done, I've managed to get a national conference presentation out of it without doing too much work on that. In comparison to another project, so in intensive care, they've started a staff peer support service. So this is the mental health project that I was mentioning a bit early on. So this is a peer support service for staff to access if they've encountered something quite troubling in their work in an ICU and would like some peer support from that, but not necessarily psychological support. So that's only actually started with the first training sessions occurring for those peer support tutors in January. So that's been quite slow progress in comparison. So we've only just started to get an evaluation questionnaire up and running, and it's likely going to be followed up probably in the region most likely of years as opposed to weeks or months. However, this is something, and you may find this with not necessarily only QI projects or audits in the future, but loads of projects where you may have to follow things up over a continuous amount of time. So just consider when you are doing projects like that, whether you still want to play a heavy role in following up a project, which might mean, for example, if you're presenting at a conference or publishing it, you'll be first author or that, or whether you want to take a backward step as you move on to other jobs or as you progress through training. So my main takeaway points of advice for QI projects and audits, and I would encourage you all to do this, even if you're not necessarily interested in QI projects or audits, but other types of projects, is to contact your educational and clinical supervisors early on. By doing this, it sets the ball rolling, not only for that element of the job, so completing projects, but also for how you perform it relative to the clinical aspects. Make sure you pick your projects wisely and that you actually want to do the projects and whether they're geared towards your particular speciality or particular interest. Make sure that you are able to appropriately manage your time and consider whether or not you want to commit in the long term to the projects that you're actually sort of thinking about or considering. And make sure that you sort of have in the back of your mind, I wouldn't say it's the sole reason for doing a project, but consider what training do you want to do in the future? What speciality are you aiming to work in the long term? And try and see if you can tailor your QI projects or audits towards that. So that is the main points I had for my QI project section of the talk. I'm now going to move on to discuss about the AFP program. I just wanted to check before I do move on, while it's fresh in your minds, are there any questions that anyone has about QI projects or audits at all?
There's no question on the chat so far, Faris.
Okay, wonderful. I'll move on then if that's all right then. So I'll go over AFP. I'll go over the application process very briefly, and I'll spend more time talking a little bit more about the projects. So For AFP in general, for applying for it, the main process for most academic foundation programs across the UK is that you have white space questions which are basically personal statement questions that you have to answer, that you have to write answers to. You then have an academic interview. So that's usually composed of what make up the majority of training interviews now, which is essentially clinical related questions, which often relate to clinical scenarios, very similar to an OSCE or ISCE format. And then questions in relation to what projects or experiences you've had in the past. And then from that, you'll either get an offer for your first choice or one of the ranked choices that you have for your job. So I was very fortunate in that I managed to get my first choice rotation for the year, which was in pediatrics first, intensive care second, and then currently respiratory at the moment. So just to go over what I've actually done with my AFP year so far. So broadly speaking, with an academic foundation year 1 year, you can broadly split what a doctor does in that time into the clinical requirements and the academic requirements. So to basically summarize, the clinical requirements as an academic foundation year 1 doctor are exactly the same as the standard F1. So in Wales, you still have the 3 rotations of 4 months. You still have exactly the same competencies. So when you start to work as a foundation year doctor, you'll still have CBDs and mini CAXs, and we still have the same requirements as the standard F1. You also have clinical core procedures as well. And we have the exact same portfolio as the standard F1 in Wales as well. I believe in England, it's pretty much exactly the same as well, because in English deaneries, they tend to have just only the 4-month block in F2 year. So they know their entire 2 years of rotation. The portfolio still tends to be exactly the same. And then the second component of an AFP year in Wales is composed of your academic time. So broadly speaking, throughout the 3 rotations, this practically works when you get days, not days off, but at days that you are allowed to dedicate towards academic activities. So broadly speaking, you can pretty much decide what you want to do within that time. But the main things that you're looking to develop are experience within leadership, education, and research. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to dedicate time towards all 3 of those, but broadly speaking, those are the things that which you're aiming to cover within that academic time. So as I've already mentioned, the clinical requirements are basically exactly the same. And my biggest advice for anyone considering doing academic training, not necessarily the foundation program, but academic training later on, is that because you have exactly the same requirements, you need to be very organized and make sure you start fulfilling those requirements quite early on. There's nothing worse than when you're a month away from ARCP, which is the annual assessment that you had every year, and you still got over half of your portfolio left to complete. And that can sometimes be incredibly stressful and difficult to get done. So with your organization, you need to, as I've already mentioned with QI projects and audits, I would strongly encourage you to contact your supervisors and your teams quite early on. And if you have any outstanding requirements, whether that be CBDs, mini CAXs, or core procedures, or it's, say, for example, reflections, or getting the QI project done, let them know that you need to do that quite early on so you can focus on that within the coming weeks or the entire 4-month block that you have upcoming. With regards to your academic time, so in Wales, it's quite good in the fact that there isn't a tick box that you have to fulfill to demonstrate active use of that time. So it's effectively up to you what you do with that. I've known academic foundation year doctors who solely use their academic days just to complete extra qualifications. I've known academic doctors who've used that time solely for teaching. What I would broadly say is that the academic days can be split into those that are planned and unplanned. So, for example, with myself, I've tended to use a lot of my academic days for scheduling in meetings in relation to the projects that I'm doing, just because I know I won't have any clinical pressures essentially that will stop me from attending those meetings. Whereas the days that I've had less structured, I've tended to contribute towards mainly teaching planning, I would say, or towards my PGC sort of teaching modules and going through the material in relation to that. It also can be quite helpful to schedule teaching activities on those days. So because of having academic days, I often use my academic days to teach second year students throughout the year. And it meant because that entire day was blocked off, I didn't have to sort of sacrifice any clinical commitments as a result of that. The projects you end up doing in each of the blocks are very much, I would say, dependent on what you want to do primarily, but also if your supervisor has any keen interests. So that's why it's really important to get in touch with them early on, because they may have some things which they would be quite keen for you to do if you wanted to do. So it's important to establish that quite early on. So what have I done broadly with my time? So splitting, as I mentioned earlier, my projects into education, research and leadership. I've just tried to summarize some of the ones that I've ended up taking on. So with regards to education, I've ended up being involved in two large programs that have run essentially throughout the academic year. One of those has been in question writing for, which is questions written by foundation year doctors, but contributing to the UK Progress Test Consortium. That is basically a massive question bank that's used by medical schools throughout the UK, including Cardiff. And also another teaching program that I've been involved in organising with two final year medical students at Cardiff is the Clinical Foundations teaching program. And this has been composed of webinars. So we delivered a series of 90 webinars from last September all the way to last December for mainly fourth and fifth year students. And we've also delivered face-to-face clinical teaching throughout the year, which has mainly been things such as clinical skill teaching and mock ISCE examinations. As I've already mentioned, I also contributed a large amount of my academic time to teaching on behalf of the health board. So that wasn't, towards the end, I was actually organising some of these sessions, but a lot of these sessions I was just acting as the tutor and I had all the materials provided for me. But having the academic days meant that I was a bit more flexible in being able to use my time to do that. That's not to say if you're not an academic foundation year doctor, you can't do that teaching. That teaching should be available across pretty much every health board in Wales. It just might mean that as a standard F1, it may be difficult to get the time because it's usually in the afternoon that these teaching sessions are arranged. It may be quite difficult to guarantee that you'll be available for those sessions. Relevant to research or QI projects, I would say that I've largely focused on doing QI projects over original research. The main reason for that being is that QI projects are often something that you can keep on going without sort of pressures or the need to go in and do spend a large amount of your time doing data collection. So the biggest QI project that I've ended up being involved with is probably the bronchiolitis, an update of the bronchiolitis database in Cardiff and Vale. And this is done every year and has been going on since 2014. But having updated that, as a result of that, we've submitted the paper at the moment, which is up for publication, and we're just waiting to hear the result of that. I've already talked about both the ICU QI projects that I've been involved with, but I spent a large amount of my academic time that I had whilst I was in intensive care working on those things. And throughout the year, I've been working with a couple of psychiatrists on an education paper, which is looking at interventions for depression and anxiety, which isn't a piece of original research, but is more a collection of what research, sort of similar to a systematic review, but less thorough. And we've been working on that steadily throughout the year. Also looking at leadership. So apart from doing qualifications, this can be quite hard to do unless you've got a position, for example, within the BMA or a similar organisation. What I've managed to do as part of my academic foundation year is I've just recently completed the sort of first part of training to be a med trim practitioner. For those that don't know what that is, that's an organisation which is run by one of the consultant anaesthetists at Cardiff, which is involved in trauma-related care for people, in this case, healthcare professionals who are witness or involved in a potentially traumatic event. I've also, through applying to do a medical education fellowship at a medical education company called Medics Academy, I've also been involved in a lot of their program management and have actually been offered an employment position, which I'm going to be starting later this year with that organisation. And actually, from doing that fellowship, I've actually started a postgraduate certificate in clinical practice, education and leadership, which is an 18-month course, but has included teaching on both education and leadership. So that's a broad summary of some of the things that I've done this year. So if I could go back, and this advice applies not just for an academic or foundation year or academic training, but just foundation years or clinical training in general. The main things I would have done differently. So you could probably see that I tried to do a lot of small projects, I would say, throughout the year, as opposed to doing one massive one. I probably would have, if I could go back, have said no to a couple of the things that I was asked to do, mainly because I felt I would have been able to dedicate more of the time to the other projects that I'd already taken on. This can be quite a difficult skill to take on, to be able to say no to things, because you're often worried about the repercussions and whether it's the right thing to do or not. But often you have to think about whether saying yes to something means that time is going to be taken away from your other commitments. And that may not necessarily be totally to do with work. That may also be related to your hobbies outside of medicine and also your personal life. So just take that into consideration when you are taking on board projects in general. What I also would have, I think, largely liked to do, so you could see that I tried to do a lot of stuff within medical education. And I think in hindsight, I probably would have focused a lot more time on that as opposed to doing projects related to other things, just because I would like to stay involved in medical education in the long term. I'm also quite interested in going into a career within psychiatry, and I don't think I did as many projects as I would have liked within psychiatry this year. So if I could go back, I would try to gear more of what I was doing towards psychiatry and medical education, whilst trying to get rid of some of the stuff that was less geared towards that. And in relation to both those things that I've just mentioned, I would just feel not guilty about saying no to those things or focusing more about what I want to do, just because at the end of the day, being taken on these projects is kind of an extra thing. And one of the good things about a career in medicine is that even though getting into some training programs can be quite competitive, you pretty much will always be guaranteed work of some sort. You'll always be able to find some opportunity for a job. And a lot of what you're trying to do projects wise, essentially extra stuff that you want to take on because you want to do it rather than as a process to climb a career ladder. And I would feel less guilty about worrying about sort of what impact that might have by saying no to a particular project, or gearing things towards more what you want to do. So I thought I'd briefly summarize the pros and cons of doing an academic training program in general. I'll go over these very quickly. So before entering an academic foundation program, for most things, so whether you're applying for AFP or an academic training program in England later on as part of core training or something similar, it is usually a separate application that's a more competitive process. However, it usually gives you a bit more flexibility with regards to choice of rotations, which is quite good. And the separate application, a lot of people actually find beneficial. So for example, as applying for AFP, I got interviews, which you don't get as by the standard route. During the year, you get academic time, which is very well protected. And even if you decide you don't want to continue doing an academic career in the future, you often given quite a good taste of what that can involve, but your CV is usually quite well boosted as a result of it. And it can lead you, so as an academic foundation year doctor, if you particularly enjoyed the academic side, you can consider whether or not to apply for academic core training as well. And often by doing an AFP, just in the nature of doing it, as long as you've done something reasonably productive as a result of that, you can have quite a boosted application as a result of that. What I would say are the main cons of doing an academic training program just in general. So it's often that it's an additional stress, it's an additional thing to apply for, particularly applying in 5th year where you've got SJT and PSA, it's all around the same time. So it's just something else that you need to be quite time conscious of. During any academic training program, and I've experienced this year, you do have less clinical time, but the same clinical requirements as everyone else. That's not necessarily, that just means I think you have to be a bit more time efficient and use your clinical days and make sure that you're learning from them as well as doing your job effectively. It just means that you have to be arguably even better than the other foundation year doctors in making the most of the clinical time that you have. It can often be particularly doing it the way that Wales does it, 1 day a week or doing just a 4-month block. That's often quite limited time, and it might be quite tricky if, for example, things don't exactly go into plan to get things done productively. With regards to after any, whether the AFP or an academic training program, you may arguably have less clinical experience. So that's something to bear in mind as well. And it may take longer for you to finish your particular training in whatever specialty. So those are my main pros and cons. Just to go over briefly what I'm considering for the future. So I think doing an academic training program has actually helped me consider what speciality I want to do in the future. And it's also helped me consider whether I want to do an academic training program versus a standard training program as well. It can also be quite helpful as well for considering what you want to do as a portfolio career. So what I would say in balance moving forward is that you need to consider all these things when you're not only doing an academic foundation year program, but also when you're doing your foundation year program in general as well, and thinking about what career pathway you want to do in the long term. So those are all the slides I had. I will just stop sharing my screen. And we now have quite a lot of time for questions. So if anyone wanted to ask any questions at all, you can either say them out loud or post them in the chat. Okay, I'm going to assume that no one has any specific questions.
I've just posted the feedback form. If everyone can just fill it in, it would be very much appreciated.
I will also post my email in the chat if anyone doesn't necessarily want to ask any questions now, but wants to get in touch with me regarding any particular advice or anything specific they want to know. And yes, please do fill in the feedback form. We would greatly appreciate any feedback as well, just regarding this evening and how things have gone. But if there aren't any questions, thank you very much all for attending. if you are in fourth or fifth year, good luck with the rest of the year that you do have. And if you are starting in August, best of luck with starting your new jobs as well. It is very different when you do start working in some good ways, but also you do miss some things from med school. So if you do need any advice at any point, my email's in the chat, and I know Carvan, who's also an F1 in Cardiff as well, I'm sure she would be happy to help and answer any questions that anyone has as well. But thank you all very much for attending.
Thanks, Faris. It was very helpful.
Cool. Shall we stop record?
Yeah.